Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today is my end of season power rankings for the 2023 season. I will be ranking all 19 Overwatch League teams, all of the regular franchised teams, all in one list. So I'm going to try to get through the teams pretty quickly. I'm not going to try to spend too much time on any one team, but as always, when I do these power rankings, first thing I need to say is that this is, of course, my rankings. It may differ from your rankings. I may have teams in places different than you may do. Obviously, it's not based purely on standings and where they finished the season. Certain things that I will rate higher. Playoff performance is very important. How you do in the playoffs is very important to how you are rated. So if you did very well in the playoffs, you'll probably be higher than if you did poorly in the playoffs. You get the gist of it. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on my list. Let me know your own list, whatever you want to let me know in the comments down below. I love to have discussions and conversations with you about these power rankings. But without further ado, let's go and jump into the first spot, number 19 on this list. No real shocker, at 19, I have the Vegas Eternal. They finished the season 0-16, minus 43, only winning 5 maps all season. Very poor season from the Vegas Eternal. They did not get anything really going. They've rebuilt their roster in the middle of the season. Didn't really work. They did better, but it wasn't enough. Obviously, tons of players on that team. Coming in a mixed roster, it just was never really going to work. They couldn't get it to click. As much as I think Knife had a good year for this team, and as much as I would have loved to see Rack Attack walk away from this year with a win under his belt, it just wasn't meant to be for a team that just did not look good time and time again. They had a chance to get a win against the LA Valiant. Couldn't do it. That really was kind of the nail in the coffin for this team. So unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, they end up here in the 19 spot. Next at 18, I have the Los Angeles Valiant. They finished the season with a 2-14, minus 32 record. Wins over the Vegas Eternal and the LA Gladiators. They're a team that had some talent on them. They were very clearly a team that was built to basically show up and maybe find some success, but generally speaking, they were not a team that was built for winning and built for success. I thought Secret a very good year. I think he's one of those players that I am very excited to see in the World Cup and in the future of the Overwatch esports scene, whatever it may be. Phenomenal player who I think in the right environment can definitely shine. This was not quite the best environment, but I thought all in all, there were some moments from Crawley that were pretty good. I thought Liar and CJ had some moments as well that really did impress me, especially Liar with some good moments. But the Valiant just never really clicked. They never really looked like the most solid team. I don't think, like I said, they were ever meant to do more than really what they ended up doing. But they at least were able to get some wins on the board, and that puts them here in the 18 spot. In the 17 spot, I have the Shanghai Dragons. They finished as the worst team in the Eastern region. If you want to base it on their play-ins results, they were the first team eliminated from the Eastern region play-ins. They didn't have a great season in general, but they definitely ended it pretty poorly. Disappointing end to a very storied franchise, of course. Began the Overwatch League as the worst team in the league. Ended in 2021 as champions. We're still a pretty solid team in 2022. Rebuilt their team this year. They had some talent and definitely some pop-off moments from Viper and Hisu. But I don't think Gangnam Jin, Iris, Bebe, that trio, mostly Gangnam Jin, Iris, of course, ever really clicked, ever really got it going. I thought they looked better with Fate than with Fleta, but it just was not enough to ever really overcome, I think, the weaknesses of that backline. They just never really clicked. They never really looked great. They lost to Sinprisa Gaming like 3 times. You can't lose to SPG 3 times as an Overwatch League team and expect to have a pretty good placement on here. They won some games, that's the thing they have going for them, but beyond that, this team just was not very good, and that is why I have them here at 17. At 16, just one spot above, I have the Guangzhou Charge. They started the year phenomenally. They were the best team in the Eastern region for several weeks. They had that loss to the Seoul Infernal. That was their first loss of the season, and then everything kind of went downhill from there. They lost to Dreamers in the Spring Stage qualifiers, or Spring Stage knockouts. They were unable to qualify for the Midseason Madness. They got rid of Piggy and Choi Se-wan. They went to a full Chinese roster, and then the team just did not perform particularly well at that point in time. They just didn't look very good in the second half of the year. I think they were a little too one-dimensional in the first half of the year. but it worked because Choi Se-won and Jimmy were playing well and were able to find success pretty significantly. I think their support line was playing very well, and Piggy was playing well, but I think once they made the changes in the mid-season point, once teams started to figure them out, it became quite clear that this team just was not going to really find a lot of success. They were able to get some, level of success in the play-ins, beating the Shanghai Dragons. It was a close series. They were basically a little bit better than Shanghai. It wasn't anything special. So good run at the beginning of the year, bad run at the end of the year. They find themselves here in the 16th spot. At 15, I have the LA Gladiators. They finished the season with a 6-10, -12 record. This team, an unfortunate season for them. Beginning of the year, they were a very good team. They got second in the Pro-Am, of course, for the preseason tournament. They were one map away from making it to the midseason madness over the Florida Mayhem. They made some changes midseason, releasing Dante and bringing in Marvel. They brought in Cal as well later on just to kind of bolster this roster after some of the other players like Lastro went back to Korea. I don't really know what happened with Babel. I don't know if we've heard about that. And things just never really worked out for the Gladiators. They had a very rough second half of the year. I believe the only game they won was a game against the New York Excelsior. They just struggled. Of course, they lost to the LA Valiant. The first loss, or the first win for the Valiant on the season was that game against the Gladiators. So it was a rough second half of the year for them. Definitely not a good look from them, and disappointing for where this team had been last year and earlier this year. Certainly disappointing to see them get there, but by the end of it, they just were not playing well. They didn't look very good. I think there's a lot of internal stuff going on. Part of that could have been the collapse of the parent organization. So unfortunate end of the season for them, but that's why I have them down here at 15. At 14, I have the New York Excelsior. Yes, they did lose to the Gladiators in the second half of the season. They also beat the Gladiators in the second half of the season, and in general just had a better second half of the season and a better season overall, finishing with a 7-9 record with a -5 differential. They had a good win late in the year against the Vancouver Titans that I think really did make them look to be in a decent spot. I think they were also a kind of flat team. I don't think they had a lot of dimension to them. I think they struggled to play things that didn't fit in the kind of Tracer Sombra meta. Even then, they weren't amazing at the meta when you compare them to teams like Atlanta or Houston or even Florida in their own region, or Boston. Some of those kind of top-level teams that did well in the midseason madness. New York was never going to compete with those level of teams. But I also think they weren't really necessarily competing late in the season with teams like Vancouver, except for that one game, or Toronto. They split some time with Toronto. They were never really able to kind of get over the ledge. But I think once the meta moved away from that, you saw they didn't look great in the play-ins and they lost to the Washington Justice. It was pretty clear that they were not the most comfortable on a variety of comps. I think they were players on this roster that were good at certain heroes, but they weren't deep enough to really make a good run. And that is ultimately why I think their season ended when it did. It was an okay run, definitely better than most people expected, but not good enough to get them above 14. At 13, I have the San Francisco Shock. They finished the season with an 8-8 -3 record. Very disappointing year from them. A lot of people, myself included, had them picked to win the Overwatch League this year. I thought, going into the season, I thought with Proper and at the beginning of the year, Heesang, as well as phenomenal tank players with Max and Junbin, Finn, who had a good year last year, Vindame had a great year last year coming in on the support role. This team looked like they should do well, and they just could not get it together. They made a lot of changes the midseason, bringing in Probe and Luke Mino and Renko and Striker, and they found a little bit more success, but ultimately it was not enough. I think that the team just never really looked great. Their play-ins result, not very good, losing to both Vancouver and London in pretty one-sided fashions. Just not a good look from them this year. I think they just did not have the level of play you wanted. I think they abandoned too heavily on that early year roster instead of making the additions they needed to make. I think bringing in someone like Probe or Striker early in the year maybe would have helped this team out a lot more than it did late in the year when their roster at that point in time was blown up. I think their mentals were gone. It was just not a good season from them, and that's why I have them as low as I do. You would have expected a lot more from them, Very disappointing. Maybe not the worst team in the league, but I think definitely the most disappointing. At number 12, I have the Washington Justice. They finished the season with a 6-10 -9 record. Another team that did not have a good second half of the season. They were good in the first half. They're one of the teams fighting for the play-ins for the midseason madness. They were one of the last teams kind of standing then. Second half of the year, not as good for them. They did make a change, dropping FD God, picking up Donghoon. This team, to me, was very much heavily carried by ATVI. He was a phenomenal player this year. You saw what he could do on Genji and Tracer, and he really stepped up. If he wasn't on this team would not be this high on the power rankings. Their play-in results were pretty good, and that's honestly the thing that puts them ahead of the Shock and New York. They beat New York. They played very well against London. They almost reverse swept London. Yeah, they struggled against Toronto, but to me, they just had a more complete end of the season. I think that they had a little bit more fire and juice to the way they played. They had a win condition. You felt confident in the way they could play. So they struggled quite a lot in the second half of the year, but I think in the play-ins, we saw some of the best play from them we've seen in a while. And I think they ended the year in a bit of a more promising way than the Shock did. So I have them one spot above them. Not that much better than them, honestly, but all in all, I think the Justice looked pretty good this year. Had some struggles, but ultimately, even this team I think was better than many people expected them to be. At number 11, I have maybe a bit of a shocker, but I have the Seoul Infernal in this spot. Yes, they made the playoffs, and yes, they were technically the top team coming out of the Eastern region at season's end, but this is a team that their end-of-season results are not impressive. Their last 4 games were a 3-0 loss to the Houston Outlaws in the playoffs, a 3-0 loss to the Dallas Fuel in the playoffs, a 3-2 loss to the Seoul Dynasty in the Summer Stage Knockouts, and a 3-1 loss to O2 Blast in the Summer Stage Knockouts. Their last win was August 27th against SPG, and it was their only win in the Summer Stage Knockouts. So when the meta change happened, they won a single game, and it was against SPG. Just not a very impressive end of season from them. I think, honestly, they were the weakest team in the playoffs. Going into the playoffs, the player performance was not good. Yes, they had the injury to Fixa having to be replaced by Hyunjae. I think that is a part of why this team probably struggled late in the year. But I was not impressed by them. I think they did not show up when you needed them to. I think there's a very real chance that if they had to go in through the play-ins, they would not have even qualified for the playoffs. I think if in a world where O2 Blast qualifies and the Infernal, the Fuel, and the Dynasty were all in the play-ins, Infernal would not have made it out. They just were not playing well at the end of the year, and I think that the results in the playoffs and in the knockouts show that they were just not playing their best Overwatch, and that's why I have them down here in the 11th spot. At number 10, I have the other team representing the city of Seoul, the Seoul Dynasty. They ended the year in a pretty decent place. Obviously, they did not make it out of the play-ins, losing to the Dallas Fuel twice in the play-ins, but they also 3-0'd the Guangzhou Charge twice. And in the Summer Stage Knockouts, they did decently well with wins over O2 Blast, the Seoul Infernal, SPG, and the Guangzhou Charge. So winning the Summer Stage Knockouts, winning their bracket in the Knockouts, was very impressive for a team that really started to click late in the year. It's unfortunate that they just didn't have the results in the first tournament to kind of potentially put themselves into the playoffs with their really good performance in the Summer Knockouts. But I thought they ended the year much better than the Infernal. I thought they looked a lot better. I thought they were playing better. I thought that their tank performance was better. I thought Belosria looked really good in the Knockouts. I thought Prophet still was putting up very good numbers. I think Vindame coming into this roster in the second half of the year helped a lot improve their support line, bolster their support line. All in all, I just think the Dynasty ended the year better than the Infernal. They had a much rougher first half of the year, losing to the Dragons a couple times, bowing out pretty early in the Spring Stage Knockouts. But really in the Summer Stage, they showed that this team had a lot of potential, could have done a lot more. They just fell flat. They just struggled too much early on to get there. But I thought they were a decent team, all things considered, and I think that when you look at their end-of-season results, it makes sense why I would put them and why I think they finished ahead of the Infernal in this power ranking. At number 9, jumping back over to the Western region, we have the Vancouver Titans. They finished the year with an 8-8 plus 7 record. Unfortunate roster change for them halfway through the season, forcing them to pivot to a double flex DPS lineup with Hisang and Sugarfree that actually worked better than I would have expected. I will give this team a lot of credit. I thought when those two came in together, two players that have very similar hero pools, this team would not look very good. I think Sugarfree had a phenomenal year this year. He was my rookie of the year. Very close competition there between he and Donghawk, but I was very impressed by Sugarfree this year. I thought Hisang played much better when he joined this Vancouver roster than he did on San Francisco. And I think Punk had a great year. I think Faith and Crimzo had arguably, at least for Faith, arguably Faith's best year ever. Crimzo has been very consistent and very solid for the past several years, so it's hard to say if this was his best year, but he certainly played well. I think this Vancouver Titans team was very, very good. They just didn't have that next gear to get them over some of the other really good teams in the Western region. But I think they were a very solid team this year. I think they had a very strong run, especially in the summer stage. I thought they looked really good in the second half of the year. That loss in New York late in the year, the loss at Toronto, definitely hinders them a little bit. They came very close against London as well in the play-ins. Very good run from them. Ultimately not enough, however, to get them out of this 9 spot in my power rankings. At number 8, I have the team that I think was the best team that missed out on the playoffs, the Toronto Defiant. They finished an 8-8 record, 0 differential, perfectly mid, as all things should be, with the Toronto Defiant. I thought this team, especially the second half of the year, looked very, very good. I think the additions of Spectra and Opener really helped this team out a lot. It made this team a lot better, a lot more consistent. I think you can consider they were 1 game away from being at the playoffs, playing in front of their home crowd in Toronto. So close. They just could not get past London Spitfire. I think London was a bad matchup for the Defiant, and that's part of why they lost. And they committed a little too hard to the Ilari style of play with Surmajed. I would have liked to see them play a little bit more of that Lucio style with Opener in that had helped them find a lot of success at other points in time. London beat a lot of teams. There's no shame in losing to London Spitfire. I thought this team looked much better later in the year than most of the other teams in the league. Like I said, they beat Vancouver, which was a very good win from them. They were a map away from beating the Boston Uprising in the playoffs, or in the play-in, so they had multiple chances to get into the playoffs. They just fell flat a couple of times. But I thought they had a very good end of the year. Spectra, to me, was the best player to join a team second half of the year. Had he had more time, he certainly would have been one of the front runners for the Rookie of the Year award. I think this team was very good. I just think that they got a little too bad in terms of their draw and their luck at the end of the season. But they looked really good for a lot of that second half of the year. And I think that this is a team that really would have been... Honestly, I would have rather had this team in the playoffs than the Soul Infernal. I think they would have been a much more fun watch. It would have been a much more interesting team. So, unfortunate, but I do have them here in the 8th spot. Moving on to our next playoff team. All playoff teams from here on out. I have the Dallas Fuel at 7. They did win a playoff game, which is not... you can't say the same for teams like the Soul Infernal or the Atlanta Reign. I think the Dallas Fuel, their problem was they committed a little too hard to the Zarya comp. It was good against the Infernal, where the Infernal were just not a very good team. It got pretty easily beaten by Florida and Houston. I think I would have liked to see them commit to the Sigma a little bit more once that was the thing that we figured out was the meta. I know there was talk about how they had not even scrimmed the Sigma going into the playoffs, and they kind of just picked it up late on in the playoffs when it became clear that that was kind of a thing they could play. I think this team had a lot more potential. I think they just fell a little flat. But to me, beating a Soul Infernal team that I think just wasn't good at all doesn't really impress me much. The 2 games where they were really tested against good opponents, they didn't look incredible. They had some moments of success. Obviously, this team won the Grand Finals in 2022, so there was a lot of pressure on this team to succeed. I still think Hanbin, I still think Sparkle, I still think Edison have a lot of potential. They're great players. The Bliss had a great year this year. It's just clear that the losses of Chio and Fielder really hurt this team. Fearless not being there certainly hurt this team quite a bit. but I still think they have a lot of core pieces that made this team work pretty well. And I think there's a lot of reason to think this team is still potentially a core you could build around for the future. But it was clear that they just did not have the full flexibility you'd need to be a really top elite level team, and this playoffs just was not the meta for them. At number 6, I have the Atlanta Reign. I know you've all been waiting for where I would put this team. They finished the season with the best record in the Overwatch League, 14-2, plus 33 differential. They were phenomenal. They won the midseason madness, dominant first half of the year. Didn't lose a game until the second half of the season, a couple games into it. But they did not play particularly well in this playoffs, getting reverse swept by the Hangzhou Spark and then losing 3-0 to the London Spitfire. It was a bad run from them. I think that they just did not have an answer to the Reinhardt Rush comps from the London Spitfire. And I think that ultimately in that series against the Hangzhou Spark, it was two teams that wanted to run the same composition, but the tank diff was just too big. Gushui looked a lot better than Donghak. I don't think all the blame is on Donghak. He was the only rookie player on this roster against one of the greatest Winston players of all time. It's very hard to perform there. The rest of the team needed to really step up and improve and help him out, and they just were not able to do that. It was a phenomenal series as well from Shy and Leave and Monk on the Hangzhou Spark. So like I said, no blame fully on one player, but they just clearly did not have the answer for the dive comps that the Spark pulled out, and this team struggled in the playoffs. For a team that was so good for the first half of the year, this is definitely a very disappointing end to the season for them. Lip was an MVP candidate, one of the favorites. He probably got second in voting, if I had to guess. I haven't seen any confirmation or not. But this is a team that had tons of role stars everywhere. Lip, Stalker, I think Donghak was a role star, maybe? No, he wasn't. But their supports were role stars, their damage were role stars. They were a really good team this year. They just could not get it done at the end of the year. It was a very disappointing end of the season for them. And I think they certainly have what it takes to win some games. I think they were on the tougher side of the bracket, which hurt them a bit. But ultimately, it was just not a good run from them, and they finish here in my power rankings in the 6th spot. At number 5, I have the London Spitfire. They finished the season with a 7-9 -4 record, but they made the playoffs. They won enough games late in the year to get themselves that spot in the play-ins. They went on a monstrous tear in the play-ins, finding wins over the Toronto Defiant, the Vancouver Titans, the Washington Justice, San Francisco Shock. The only team that they lost to in the play-ins and in the playoffs was the Boston Uprising. 3-1 every single time. It is the kryptonite team for London. But outside of that, they looked phenomenal. Their Reinhardt Rush compositions were so good and so solid. Phenomenal job coaching this team from Christopher. And just a team that knows their identity and plays to it so well. This team was, at one point in time, I want to say 2-8. They had a really bad start to the year. They seemingly were out of it. They were going to be a team that missed out on the play-ins, and they just went on a tear late in the year, finding tons of wins where they needed them, getting that good run in the play-ins, and making it all the way to a phenomenal playoffs game where they were able to win against the Atlanta Reign, the mid-season madness champion. So, phenomenal playoffs for them. It's just unfortunate that they ended up with the Boston Uprising, the one team best equipped to fully handle what they were able to do. But it was a very good year from them, especially the second half of the year, especially the postseason. Phenomenal performance from them. Have to give them a lot of credit for what they were able to do. I think they are a team that deserves a ton of credit as one of those kind of big and best underdog stories we've seen. The 2022-2023 London Spitfire will go down in history as one of the best, most entertaining teams that the Overwatch League has ever seen, and just phenomenal way to end this 2023 season for them. The top 4 is where it gets a little bit tricky for me. 3, 2, and 4 could all be moved around in a variety of different ways. But ultimately, I ended up putting the Boston Uprising here in the 4 spot. And there's a couple of reasons why. The only team they were able to beat in the playoffs, if you look at it, was the London Spitfire. They lost to the Hangzhou Spark twice and they lost to the Florida Mayhem. I think Boston was the team that played the best against the Mayhem. I think that Boston was the best equipped to handle what the Mayhem were able to do. I think their second loss to the Spark was more of a mental boomage. I don't think they really cared about the third place game in the same way that the Spark did. And I think the first loss to the Spark, they just started to fall apart and crumble. I think it was odd that they started committing very heavily to the Winston dive that the Spark wanted to play. Same thing that happened to Atlanta happened to Boston as well. So you can't fully flame the Uprising for it. Uprising looked a lot better against London, like I said, easily able to counter them. But it was really those two losses to the Spark that put, for me, the Boston Uprising in fourth. I definitely think they had a very good roster. They were a really good team. I think if they had made the grand finals, it probably would have been a much closer game than what we got with Houston versus Florida. But ultimately, I have to give the edge to the other three teams just because Boston, their results in the playoffs were not amazing. And I think that when you consider just the fact that they only beat one team in the entirety of the playoffs, it's hard to put this team above others who were able to find success against multiple opponents. At number 3, I have the Hangzhou Spark, and what a playoff run for this team. They finished the playoffs getting a third place finish. They only lost one game in the playoffs, which is unfortunate that they weren't able to get another shot with the way this format worked. Definitely this team, I think, had the most negative impacts from this format, but their path involved beating the Atlanta Reign in a reverse sweep, beating the Boston Uprising in a reverse sweep, and then beating the Boston Uprising again in that third place match. And they were a very good team. They looked much better than I think anybody expected them to. They seemingly were this one-dimensional Winston dive team that we saw pull out Doomfist in the playoffs and look very good as well. And they're sort of pulling that out late in the season as well. This team is phenomenal. Talent across the board. Some of the best players that have ever played the game. I think at least, I would argue 4 out of the 5 players on this starting rosters are the best players that China has ever produced at their role. Gushui is the best Chinese tank player we've ever seen. I think Shai and Leave definitively the best 2 Chinese DPS players we've ever seen. I think Monk is the best Chinese flex support we've ever seen. I rate Xerneas a little bit higher, maybe not a little higher than I rate Lengsa, though I think Lengsa was a very good fit for this team, and I think he was a phenomenal player on this team as well, and he's still one of the best that we've ever seen in terms of Chinese main support players. So this Spark roster, a phenomenal run from them. A lot of this team is going to be playing in the World Cup here in a couple of weeks, which will be awesome. Cannot wait to see this team basically come back together and potentially go on a similar style run there. What a phenomenal team. What a phenomenal story. Great playoffs from them. I would have loved to see them get another shot potentially, but unfortunately it was not meant to be. But very impressed by this team, and I am so excited that they finished here in the 3 spot. At number 2, the season runner-ups, I have the Houston Outlaws. Like I said, I think they were not the best team when it came up to matching up against the Florida Mayhem. But if you look at what they actually did in the playoffs, it was a very impressive run from them. Yes, they lost the Florida Mayhem twice in the playoffs, but they also 3-0'd the Infernal, the Fuel, and the Spark. So they dominated all 3 of the teams that came out of the APAC region. They were the APAC killers in this playoffs. Would have loved to see them match up against the Boston or in Atlanta one more time, just to kind of see how they stood against those teams. But outside of Florida, they were dominant in every other game they played. Like I said, the APAC region was nothing for this Houston Outlaws roster. The addition of Bernard, obviously controversial among many of the teams that Houston was able to add a player that late in the season. I'm a huge Bernard fan. I thought he looked very good on this roster. I thought when he got playtime, this team looked phenomenal. He was arguably the best player for the Outlaws in the playoffs. In that grand finals against the Mayhem, he played very well. He only got pulled because basically they had to rely on potentially Fearless coming in and doing Fearless heroics to win them the game. So it's tough, but the Outlaws had a very good season this year. This was the best team they've ever put together. Their results match that. They obviously finished second in Mid-Season Madness, second here in the playoffs, and I think that when you consider what the Outlaws did this year, phenomenal season from them, very good run late in the year, definitely deserving of the number 2 spot here in the power rankings. Number one, however, the obvious, no-brainer, only possible choice, Florida Mayhem, 2023 Grand Finals champions. They won the Pro-Am as well, if you really care about that. But they ended the year, phenomenal run, did not lose a single game in the second half of the season. They didn't make any changes to their roster really late in the year. They added Maka and Who Are You. Who Are You got no playtime. Maka got very little playtime. But they won a lot of games in the second half of the year. They did nothing but win. Their last loss was a 3-1 loss to the Houston Outlaws on June 18th in the lower bracket finals of the mid-season madness. Since then, it's win after win after win after win. And you have to give a lot of credit to this Mayhem roster for how good they were in the second half of the year. Led by MVP someone, this team was phenomenal. Merritt had a very good year. Obviously, he won the Grand Finals MVP. Very well deserved. Across the board, this team was phenomenal. RuPaul, Checkmate, Chorong. Everywhere on this team, it was just talent and talent and talent. Phenomenal run from them. Phenomenal roster. Fulfilling the bottom 4 teams from 2018, all winning a Grand Finals prophecy. Phenomenal year from them. Unbelievable how well they played. If the Atlanta Reign were the best team in the first half of the year, the Florida Mayhem did the exact same thing in the second half of the year, and they deserve a lot of credit for what they were able to do because they were just a phenomenal team that really did impress me time and time again in the second half of the year and even in the first half of the year, right? They were the most complete team, the most consistent team from first half to second half, finished third in midseason, first at the end of the year. They are certainly deserving of being one of the best teams that we've ever seen in the Overwatch League in 2023. Easily the best team that we saw. So there you go. There is my full 19-team power rankings for the 2023 season. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, where you agree, where you disagree, whatever it may be. I'd love to hear from you in those comments down below. But that is going to be all for this one. Thank you all once again for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more Overwatch esports content in the future, consider liking and subscribing, as your support does help out a lot with the channel. I want to thank you all for the support throughout 2023. It's been amazing. It's been phenomenal. The year's not over yet. We still got some stuff to cover, but so far your support's been incredible, and I cannot wait to see where things go from here. But that's all for today. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.